If we are going to have real justice in this society, we must go to the root. We sometimes forget, and perhaps it's even intentional forgetting, that the racism that we are dealing with today justified the use of enslaved people to generate wealth for others, from white planters to bankers to textile makers. The prosperity of this country is linked to the ancestors of 40 million Americans, and it's also linked to the stolen lands of indigenous people. Wealth in this country has generated a gap that is insurmountable for many, many Black people. Wealth means security in America. Wealth is assets and investments minus debt that allows you to buy a home in a nice neighborhood with better funded schools, and to send your children to college with less debt, and even to get through an emergency without becoming homeless or destitute. Wealth is security and peace of mind. But wealth is not something people create by themselves. It accumulates over generations. Today, the average Black family with children holds 1 cent of every dollar that the average white family with children holds. Racial wealth equity is essential and to justice, and at the center of any policies addressing racial wealth inequity has to be reparations. Reparations are not new. The Germans provided reparations to the victims of the Holocaust. Even Russia, when they freed the serfs, gave land to them. Today I am interviewing Kirsten Mullen, co-author of From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century, and she's going to talk about a real plan for reparations and true justice in this country. What meaning do you make of all of this powerful look at the disparity, the inequality, the violence against Blacks? How do you see this affecting the reality of putting in place a reparations plan now?
This is another opportunity for the United States to take the right path.
Right.
It's one of many.
Right.
We have the internet, really, and cell phones to thank for the visibility
exactly
of these harms, these atrocities, these murders. They're not new. And I think because they're coming at us boom, 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 so fast, one after another. I mean, you mentioned George Floyd, but there's also Breonna Taylor, there's Ahmaud Arbery, and many others.
Yes, there are.
But because we're all at home and we're watching these devices, we're seeing this, it looks like something new. It looks like something that's coming out of the blue, but people are beginning to go back and look at the most recent, and the one before that, and the one before that, and the one before that. I think part of it too is because we have this time out of time, those of us who are not desperately working in essential services, we're able to make more connections. I was thinking myself about my own family. When I was, not even 10 years old, and let me back up and say, my research is in anthropology and folklore. And I write a lot about race, I write about history, and I write about art. And I'm just especially interested in, the stories that we tell that help us understand who we are and what our connections are to each other. And so one data point, my mother and my maternal grandparents, this is growing up in Fort Worth, Texas, were involved in the civil rights movement. My grandfather, Lowell Paxter Mitchell, was a Baptist minister, and he was one of the early participants in the Interdenominational Alliance. Just unheard of, especially in Texas in the 1960s. And my mother took my sister and me to our first march in Fort Worth, Texas. And this is days after the Episcopal priest and social activist Jonathan Myrick Daniels was murdered. He was murdered August 1965 in Hayville, Alabama. Now, Alabama is where my dad's family is from. Okay, so Father Daniels was attempting to protect 17-year-old voting registration organizer Ruby Scales when this volunteer county deputy, Tom Coleman, shoots the priest. He's trying to shoot Ruby Scales, but he shoots the priest. Now, in March of that same year, Ruby Scales had marched, she participated in the March to Selma. Okay, so this is something that was part of my life very early, right? But you don't always make these connections. So, so fast forward to the point when our older son, this is more than 30 years ago now, was born, and Say and I are taking him to meet his paternal grandparents who lived in Florence, Alabama. Well, are you familiar with Alex Haley's novel Roots, the saga of the American family? Okay. And there's a moment, when, the baby Kunta Kinte is held high, I will call you Kunta. And so my grandfather takes Aiden, who's just baby Aiden, and holds him high. And he says, his full name, Aiden Lowell Mullen Verity, you are the 5th generation. I really didn't know what he was talking about. And it didn't occur to me to ask him, right? But the 5th generation, so I'm thinking, of what? Their Mullins keep going back. He can't be the 5th. And so it was only when Say and I began to do this research, for From Here to Equality, that I learned about the 18 Black men and women who had been lynched in and around Lauderdale County.
Oh, wow.
Okay. So the significance of our son surviving, of our family, because he was my grandfather's first grandson, great-grandson, it had a lot of meaning. But, you hear these things and family members share these stories, but we don't always inscribe them. We don't always, talk about what this means. It's almost like we're afraid to say out loud, for fear of invoking, negative spirits or something.
Right.
But a moment like today, when you've got this device at your disposal to quickly Google, who else, who are the other Black people who died at the hands, while in police custody. And then here's your list. Or if you're trying to research your own family history, it's extraordinary.
Yes, it is.
And the ability of something you learn to be spread across the country is also phenomenal. I have friends who have sought me out wanting to know, are you okay?
Right.
But then there are also people who are from different parts of my past who I haven't heard from in 20, 30, 40 years who are, reaching out.
Yes.
And some of them are learning about their own stories or speaking out about, slights, insults, micro and macro aggressions they are experiencing right now.
Right.
They didn't feel able to talk about, or, it's so common. Why should I bring that up? But they're recognizing that, everyone doesn't experience this in their day-to-day lives. Maybe it would be important for people to know what your life is like, because they're just making assumptions that you're fine, that everything's
right.
okay.
I had another thought, but it left my head, Kirsten. If I don't write things down, they're gone. But so let's talk about your plan for reparations then. And I know there are two parts, direct payments and an educational component. So do you want to start with the direct payments?
So yes, oftentimes people will say, oh, it's just a check, or, it shouldn't be a check. But we feel very strongly that direct payments to Black descendants of U.S. slavery are important, both for symbolic and also pragmatic reasons. There is a huge wealth gap in this country, and we believe that gap began with the unfulfilled promise of 40 acres to Black Americans. Had those newly freed Black people been allowed to receive, become the rightful owners of, develop, and importantly, pass down that wealth to their families, I'm not sure we'd be having this conversation. So let me back up. So there were experiments that occurred while the Civil War was taking place, at least 4 such experiments where Black people were given 40-acre land plots. And, Blacks were engaged to farm. Their harvest was, they were guaranteed a fixed payment by the federal government for their harvest of cotton and foodstuffs. And the idea was that they would, be the models so that when the war ended, the federal government would have some data.
Right. Now, did they own that land, or they were engaged to farm on it?
There were both kinds of arrangements taking place. Okay. Some of these individuals, a few number of them, like large families, were able to come together and try and actually purchase the land, because the land was being offered at more or less reasonable prices. Not quite market value. They were extraordinarily successful. The difficulty, though, comes when President Lincoln is assassinated and Andrew Johnson steps in. And after he became president, he immediately instructed the Freedmen's Bureau to cease these land grants and to reverse the ones that were in progress. And so, the titles were in doubt. I mean, you almost feel like, if they really wanted to make it possible for Black people to have this land, why didn't the government give them money so they could buy it at market rate? Right. And the freedmen were caught by not having the right designation, even though the designation they had for the titles was what the government had given them. But there were loopholes, and lawyers who were hired by the Confederates whose land had been confiscated and abandoned, the land that was used to designate these 40-acre plots, they hired lawyers who were able to figure out how to get that land back. But if they had just given the freedmen cash, they could make their own decisions about what they wanted to do. And if they wanted to purchase land, they could have done so. Just as today, a payment of cash, to our mind, is the way to go. Now, because it is federal money, you might want to put some strings on those funds. So perhaps you decide that some of the money would go toward a provision for free college tuition at state schools. Okay. Or you might decide that, just as the radical Republicans in Reconstruction realized that they needed to increase the number of polling places so that more people, Black and white, would have access to the polls. Oh, one point about that. During that period, more poor whites voted than had ever voted. Wow. Right? Because the restrictions, property ownership, having a certain amount of cash in the bank, those restrictions were either lifted completely or decreased. So poor whites enjoyed a greater level of participation in democracy during this period when these Black legislators were in place. That changes after the Black legislators are voted out,
Right.
snuffed out. But I don't know if you wanted to talk about what we've learned from studying successful reparations commissions.
Sure.
Okay. Some notes on that. So we have looked at 6 such commissions, and with an eye toward understanding how they were put together, who were the people who served on them, what were their charges, what actually happened, and what are the effects today. So we looked at both national and international commissions. And so we looked at the Holocaust. We looked at South Africa and their Truth and Reconciliation program. We looked at, and so it's the work, actually this is the work that I did especially, looking at Japanese Americans who were unlawfully interned in the United States during World War II. The Kerner Commission, which was a presidential commission. This is Lyndon B. Johnson, then president. While the riots were happening in Detroit, he appoints Otto Kerner, who was the governor of Illinois, to head this commission, to figure out what's going on. There were riots all across the country. What do we need to do? How can we fix this problem? But then coming forward, looking at the 9/11 Victims Fund, and also looking at Sandy Hook, so the horrible Connecticut shooting in an elementary school. Several of them called for a study, to look at the history. So this was the case with the Japanese American Commission, especially because many people didn't know that story. They held hearings across the country, I think maybe in 11 cities. I want to say over 700 people gave testimony. The transcripts were made available. Now that was one of the most efficient commissions. They had conducted hearings, conducted their research, and written checks in 18 months.
Wow.
To over 117,000 people.
Yeah.
Now that was a case in which the decision was made to give the same amount of money to every victim of the unlawful internments. So when you look at 9/11, it's a very interesting case. You had the appointment of Kenneth Feinberg, the special master was his title. John Ashcroft appoints him, and he has carte blanche to decide who will receive reparations and how much. There was no ceiling on the budget.
Yeah.
And so he decides that he will award restitution based on the present economic position of the individual at the point that they died. So you may have been contemplating or even enrolled in an MBA program, and perhaps one day would be a millionaire. But on 9/11, you were a courier for FedEx, and your office was on the 3rd floor. And so your compensation, your restitution is based on what you make right now. If, on the other hand, you were working for Cantor Fitzgerald and you're a financial arbitrageur and you make over $1 million, then your restitution is based on that figure. So wealth and inequality were baked into the formula. But that's exactly what happened. Now, interestingly, when Feinberg was writing about all this in 2005, he said I wouldn't do that again. That's not what should have happened. I would give the same amount to everyone. The first thing that needs to happen is HR 40, the House Bill 40, would need to be revised significantly.
And that is one that's in the House right now, to establish a commission to study and make proposals for reparations.
Yes, and there's a companion Senate bill that's almost identical to it.
Right.
But both of them need to be updated and made more comprehensive. I don't know if you want to talk about that at all.
Yes, because you have a point that differs, or 2 points, I think, or maybe more, that differ from what is right now the plan for the HR 40, which is they want to go back, the bill goes back to people all the way to the 1619,
Yes.
And that is different. So would you like to talk
Right.
about that?
So for us, the culpable party is the federal government.
Right.
And the republic is formed in 1776. Mm-hmm. It's absolutely true that horrible things happened to Black people in the United States in America between 1619 and 1776. But if you're bringing this complaint to the federal government, it has to begin in 1776. Mm-hmm. So that's the first point. We also are concerned about how the commission itself operates. I believe HR 40 provides for the president and several other elected officials to appoint members of the commission.
Right.
And we're thinking, if it's a congressional commission, then let Congress decide who those individuals should be. The bill, as it's written, is open-ended. We would like to see the work of the commission have a time clock. Mm-hmm. And I think 18 months is a good amount of time. The bill also does not spell out specifically who the recipients should be. And that also should be added, we think, to make it really clear that we're talking about Black American descendants of U.S. slavery.
Right, because there are people who do think that all African Americans should be entitled to reparations, even those immigrating here now.
You know, before 1965, a really small percentage of Blacks from the Caribbean and the continent were allowed in the United States. It's smaller than 3%. So for the most part, you know, they did not experience Jim Crow. Mm-hmm. That work had been done. Mm-hmm. And their ancestors absolutely were not denied 40-acre land grants in the United States. When Blacks across the diaspora were admitted into the United States, they were a highly select group. They were middle class in terms of their income, and they were well educated. They were more educated not only than Black Americans, they were more educated than all Americans. That's the only reason why they were allowed in the US. You know, what would it look like if, like the Jews, Black Americans had a country or countries that were advocating on their behalf for a full reparations program? And Sandy and I were just stunned. You know, we had never contemplated that. But eventually we recovered and said, you know, that would be fantastic.
Right.
You know, we were not always thinking about, you know, the fact that we're not the first to have these reckonings. We're not the first to realize that there is strength in numbers. We're not the first to say, oh, this experience that we're having is similar to what, you know, oppressed Black people have been experiencing for many, many, many years. But that was a wonderful thought. You know, what would it be? What would happen if African countries came together and said, yes, the US government should pay reparations to Black Americans, and we're not going to allow another US corporation to come here until you do.
Let's go back to, so the direct payments, but I know you also in the past have talked to going beyond direct payments to funding historically Black colleges,
Yes.
et cetera.
Yes.
So talk more about that avenue.
So reparations program could also include a portfolio, right? And that could include things like creating endowments for historically Black colleges and universities.
Right.
For communities where there is no hospital, no health clinic, one might be, built. But it might also take the form of, say you have a local group whose job it is to review business proposals. And they might have a wing that provides technical assistance. I mean, we know that significant number of businesses, regardless of who starts them, Black or white people, fail.
Mm-hmm.
And Black businesses fail in large part because they're undercapitalized.
Right.
Something like 80-90% of Black businesses have, a maximum of one employee, one paid employee. They don't have access to credit. The loans that they receive have a higher interest payment than those of whites on average. So that could be a very important component because there's so many Black people who are interested in, business enterprise.
So startup funds, is that what you're thinking?
Startup funds might be, but also technical assistance.
Yes, right.
Right?
Okay, right.
It could also take the form of illiquid assets. You might have, property, or I'm not sure people would want stocks and bonds today, but that is another form of assets that could not immediately be tapped. And this might be, property in particular, might be an option that was favored for minors, right? So that those funds couldn't be touched perhaps until they were 18. Or you could designate a proportion of the funds only to be used for, college or university training, or some other type of training that would lead to, to a work possibility.
Let's talk about the educational component.
Yes.
Give me some idea.
I think the museums can play a very critical role, especially institutions like the National Museum of African American History and Culture, the Black Smithsonian, but also the public schools. I mean, we would like to see at least 3 generations be taught about our history, an accurate American history in K-12, but also college as well. Forgetting is too easy. It doesn't take long for us to lack that recall. And we're hoping that 3 generations would be enough to cement, this history for all of us.
In light of what we are seeing today in the protests, with so many white people, and most younger, but there are some of us older folks getting out there and showing up. Do you think there is a shift going because of the white support here in the protests that might make more likely a reparations program to take place here?
I hope that's true. Reparations for Black Americans will not happen unless white Americans want it to happen.
Right.
And sometimes pressure from the outside can make a big difference. But I am encouraged by all of the people who are seeing the Black experience as many Black Americans do.